Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar about the empowered PMO. I'm Sean Dickerson from Keyed In. We're going to speak with you today about best practices, tools, tricks, and tips to make your PMO adaptable so that no matter what the business throws at you, you'll be ready. To begin, let me just walk us through the agenda. We will spend about 45 minutes on this presentation, and we'll follow that with 15 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions, moving along here in our logistics slide, you can certainly ask them in the Q&A box of the webinar tool. All the phone lines are muted right now, and so again, asking questions, do it through the Q&A box. The webinar is being recorded, and that recording and the slides will be available after the presentation. I mentioned I'm Sean Dickerson, the VP of Marketing with Keyed In. I've been in the IT industry for 20 years in a lot of different product and marketing positions. Been working almost exclusively with PMOs over the last 5 years with a couple of leading PPM vendors. And you can see some of the other details there. With me is the much more attractive Kevin Hurley, our Chief Technology Officer, who has had a variety of leadership roles in product, services, and technology over the years, including owning his own healthcare IT consulting company and some leadership roles at Pfizer. So we'll hear from Kevin in a little bit. So to begin our discussion today, I want to start by talking about why is this concept of adaptability or empowerment paramount to the project management office. And to do that, I want to refer to some recent research by Gartner. They spoke about a PMO that just goes into almost like a hibernation state. Their term was the zombie PMO. And just as a quick note, I might discourage you from searching the word zombie in Google Images. I tried to come up with something for this slide, and I haven't been able to sleep for a week. Never been a Walking Dead fan myself. But in terms of Gartner's concept for the zombie PMO, it's a project management office that is merely going through the motions, that really its day-to-day responsibilities are around compliance and clerical tasks, and there's not really an understanding of how to improve their contribution to the business, sort of the Walking Dead concept. And further, Gartner provides a quick assessment of whether your project management office is in this zombie state. I won't go through the whole assessment, but as a way to kick off our conversation, ask yourself some of these questions as I read a statement about various areas of PMO engagement. Think to yourself where your project management office or your project management efforts are. The first one is around skill set. Is your PMO perceived as the source of the best project managers? Maybe in Gartner's view, 10 to 20% of all PMs. Think about where you fall on that scale. If the answer is no, that might be an indicator that you are or heading toward this zombie state. The next one is around a best fit repertoire. Does your PMO support a fairly flexible approach to project management, allowing you to, based on the needs of a business, fit the methodology to different kinds of projects? In fact, at this point, Kevin, you're on the line with us. What's your take on this particular aspect of whether or not a PMO is in that Walking Dead state?
Yeah, it's a great statement, and Sean is much more attractive than I am, by the way. This area is really critical, I think, from a PMO perspective. As a PMO, and as many of you know, I mean, we're into the space of the SAFe, frameworks. We're into the space of, we have agile teams, we have Scrum, we have Kanban, we have a myriad of different types of waterfall that's been around for a long time, and lots of companies still use it. So your PMO really needs to have the ability to take those various methodologies that get supported inside your organization and be able to tie those together into a format that is consumable by your upper level management, which is typically looking at this PMO information. And so, for instance, I worked in the pharmaceutical field for a long time, and we had a myriad of different types of projects and different types of approaches to projects that had to be adaptable. And so our approach to those had to be adaptable and fit the needs from an organization, from a PMO perspective, to align up to what our organization's goals and objectives were to meet based on those different adaptable, different approaches to different methodologies of a project. So this is really a critical area, and if it's not being done, it's something that you really need to think about from a PMO perspective about how you manage across each of these different aspects and how you tie them together in some manner that makes sense for your organization.
That's a great point. I think I would add in this mobile social cloud world where the competition, the competitive field changes so rapidly, and therefore our strategy sometimes changes so rapidly. That puts a premium on some of these alternative methodologies to getting projects done. Sometimes we just don't have the time that we used to have to adapt and react. So thank you, Kevin. Another that Gartner talks about is focus. Where is the focus of your PMO? Is it primarily on planning and leadership support as opposed to procedural compliance and checklists? They also talk about relationships. Does the PMO maintain a clear responsibility and accountability for its portfolio while consulting with other teams dealing with non-project work? Is there a clear line of sight between the portfolio the PMO manages, the value to the business, and the accountability between the two? They also talk about the importance of resource allocation support. Is the PMO able to track the various resource allocations and help identify availability for better capacity planning and prioritization decisions? Kevin, what have you seen on the resource allocation front?
Yeah, this is a great area of focus for a PMO. One of the things that we see a lot of customers that we work with on a regular basis struggle with is not only is it knowing who's available, but it's also knowing when there's going to be an impact to our organization from a new project coming into play or portfolio changes, strategy changes. And so the ability to be able to look out and look at the future of what's going to happen based on some clear parameters that you're tracking within your programs, portfolios, and your projects allows you to start to visualize, well, when are these impacts going to hit? Can we make adjustments now so the risk to the business is actually less? So this is an area that I think from a PMO perspective is a super, super high value, because one of the most important assets in an organization is your people. And so if you're tracking and utilizing your people as best you can across your different strategic portfolio projects, then you're going to have the ability to better deliver. Your benefits will likely be better at the end of those projects, and your people will likely be happier because you're not overloading one when you know that you should be hiring three to do the same job to cover what's demanded of those projects. So this to me is a real critical area of a PMO, and really needs to be a focal point for the PMO going forward, and ties into a lot of the best practice pieces and your methodologies for how you're managing those resources.
It's interesting. I'm starting to sound like a spokesman for Gartner here, but we spent last week at the Gartner PPM Summit, and it was interesting to me how many PMOs, PMO directors came to us and described a gap between those two areas, between the management of the projects and the management of the resources. Even though they're so interrelated, it was often disparate tools or processes that were managing those, which can create some of the challenges you just talked about. And what about, Kevin, the area of prioritization? You know, we so many times our customers or prospects or friends talk about how the PMO is forced to prioritize based on executive pet projects or whoever yells the loudest.
Yeah, no, this is to me, this is the beginning of the puzzle, right? This is where it starts. You need to be working on this, on the projects and portfolios and programs that really make sense for your organization. And so if you, and a lot of the folks that we spoke to last week at the Gartner conference, was the scenario with many of those customers was, we just work on whatever comes over the line. And that's where you start to get into this PMO zombie effect, right? You're just doing whatever comes in. There's really no rhyme or reason. And one of the things around prioritization is really, it's how do you optimize your portfolio? How do you optimize the people? And how do you optimize that delivery from a revenue perspective for these organizations? That happens at that happens at the beginning. A lot of our customers implement processes, we call them heartbeats, but they implement these processes that are in place to basically be looking at, the full year forecasting, and then they're doing their monthly heartbeats, which they're actually potentially reprioritizing their portfolio based on changes in the business. All of us work in the world of change at this point in time. So having that facility to be able to see that visually and also see where it impacts your, like we were talking about above, the resources around that is really critical to being a successful PMO. That's an area where we spend a lot of time with our customers working on, from a prioritization, understanding what's the projects we should be working on, what are the benefits we're trying to get out of them, and ultimately how do we support those from an organization standpoint to be efficient and effective, and also to be able to generate the revenues we need.
All right, so we've talked about the downside. Let's fill people with some hope now, because if this zombie state is what we're trying to avoid, the opposite of that is really being an adaptable and an empowered PMO. And from this point forward, we're going to talk about some technology approaches and some best practices to help us get there. So the next topic is around technology capabilities, and what are some of the key technology approaches that are required to create this empowered PMO? Kevin, let me turn that over to you to talk through a few of these leading edge concepts that we're seeing at empowered or very capable PMOs.
Great, thanks, Sean. So I think the first slide here, which is an adaptable workflow. So many of us work in the world of stage gates, right? And having the ability to define those stage gates is critical to how our projects progress through a process, how we do heartbeats around the projects, and how well they're doing. But it also gives us the ability to have things like approval processes in place. It allows us to understand who has to be notified at each of these stages. Are there decision points that we're building into our workflow so that when it comes to potentially killing a project because it's not as effective as we thought it was, can we do it at the right time early enough so that it's not impacting the future of the portfolio? All of these things only happen if you've got that ability to have an adaptable workflow, which means that you have to have the ability to start it in one fashion, define it as we've seen on the screen here. Maybe this is our workflow. Well, that workflow is going to change over time, and we have to be able to adhere that to our portfolio of projects. So having tooling that allows you to functionally change that adaptable workflow and define all the parameters around it is going to allow you to drive your business in a lot more efficient fashion. And these are some of the key features we think from a PMO perspective are really critical. You have to be able to define your workflow. You have to be able to understand what are the things that have changed over the course of that period of time as it progresses through the workflow. So things like audit trail and tracking every field that changes within the system and knowing who changed it, when they changed it, and why they changed it, and what they changed it from and to. Those are critical things from a PMO in order to provide credibility to your organization, and also to make sure that you're seeing how projects are progressing through the process and when to make those decisions on whether a project progresses or maybe a project stops. So really critical area from an adaptable workflow perspective. One of the other key areas that we'll talk about on the next slide is really around, and so Sean, if you could just flip over to the next slide, it's really about project types. So as we talked about from a workflow perspective, we may have 5 or 6 different workflows inside of an organization. We may have a waterfall workflow. We may have a Scrum workflow. We may actually even have the foundations of a safe framework workflow. And in that, we have different variations of a project type. And those project types that follow that workflow need to be adjustable, amenable to fit within the boundaries of those workflows that we've set up. So the ability to define the project type that's going to support that type of project is critical, right? So you need to have the ability to define, what gets captured, what changes, have the ability to control who has access to it, have the ability to control what gets seen at each of these levels. Another important area is a lot of the organizations that we work with, they're multi-divisional organizations. They actually track very different things across the organization, and they want to track them in a way that supports their specific business unit, but we want everything to roll up to the larger either PMO or organizational level. So from a reporting standpoint, we can consolidate reports. We have the ability here to basically take different project types, have different information that's captured on them to support each of those various different divisional areas. So having that flexibility around those project types is really critical to any PMO to be able to support those nuances that you're going to have across your organization. You're going to have things like business as usual. You're going to have things like maybe lower priority, less strategic things that you're trying to achieve that have less conditions that they need to meet. And then you have other things that have to be much more stringent, follow a different process. So those are some of the key areas that from a projects type perspective, you need to have some flexibility in your organization to control. If you want to move on to the next slide. So the next slide is really about, we've defined workflows, we've defined the different project entities. Now it's about how we work, right? And in today's world, we're working differently. We're not working in a manner where everything's just a list and we click buttons and move around. We need to be able to visualize what's happening in the organization. So you'll see here on the screen, we've got a visualization of a portfolio Kanban board, and that portfolio Kanban board is really about where those portfolio of projects are sitting, and then going beyond that is really about where those programs and projects are sitting, and having the ability to drag and drop, having the ability to have color coding conventions around the various different project types, as well as being able to expose the relevant data on the board, as well as being able to prioritize those items in a drag and drop fashion, and also to be able to progress projects through its life cycle just through a simple drag and drop. So making the simplicity of actually managing the workflow easier and more visual for those folks that want to see it in that manner. So these are 3 areas that are really key from a PMO perspective and allowing some adaptability to those variations within a PMO. PMOs are changing. We know we're moving into more of a mixed methodology. Support was waterfall for years. We've got a lot of introduction of agile over many years now. And we're getting more and more different types of methodologies. You have to have the facilities inside the tooling supporting your PMO to support those variations. And that's what things like these last 3 slides have demonstrated.
So Kevin, let me just ask a couple of questions before we leave this technology section. What do you think are some of the competitive or industry related factors that are driving some of these changes? Like one example might be, as we think about having an adaptable workflow, I've noticed that especially with global companies, the process for approval can change very rapidly. An evolving list of stakeholders. A change in strategic direction that requires emphasis on a new element or a new team that needs to be involved in a project workflow. What other kinds of environmental or industry factors do you feel like are driving these changes?
Well, I think a lot of it is just that we're supporting a lot of different methodologies, I think is part of it. I think in the past it was we primarily focused on waterfall. I think a lot of our organizations, inclusive of ours, are moving to more of an agile mode, which gives us a lot of early indicators of things that we might want to change or things that we want to adjust as we're going through that process. And so I think it's that variation. And also, I think the tooling historically has really only supported that waterfall methodology in a pretty strict fashion. And the tooling has to start adjusting for the different variations of projects that are being executed within these PMOs. And the PMOs need to have the tools to be able to raise their hands and say, we've got it covered. And not only do we have the components to do some mixed methodology covered, but we also have the ability to roll that up into a fashion that allows us to look at, say, financials across all of our different projects and look at benefits across all our projects, even though the methodologies might be different. So I think, and it's also, I mean, it's constantly changing. The space of PMO is changing, and the PMO needs tools to be able to support that. So that's, some of the things that we're trying to introduce as part of the keyed-in solution.
Makes sense. I think it's interesting too. Sometimes we can start to feel like an agile methodology is taking over the world and there's no need for anything else. And I think one of the things you've described is there's always going to be a need to adapt to multiple methodologies and to roll that up into a single view. I think even the difference between hardware and software, if you're implementing hardware infrastructure, doesn't really lend itself to an agile methodology. You're not going to iterate on half a server, but when it comes to software, obviously it does.
Right. That's exactly right, Sean. All those points I don't think they go away, and there's that's going to be I think that's going to be a consistent thing for the PMO for quite some time.
Agreed. All right. Well, let's talk about one other element of this. So whether it is technological capabilities or best practice, getting the team to actually use those tools or best practices is a challenge that we hear over and over and over again from PMO leaders, specifically around the idea of PPM solutions. We will hear a story that sounds somewhat like this. We've done this exhaustive assessment of various project and portfolio management systems. We have selected one that we know is going to revolutionize the way we work, cure cancer, all of those things. At least that's what the vendor says. And then when the tool is rolled out, the reaction is something like this. We know that this technological approach can make things better, can improve visibility and productivity, but we're either too busy, too stressed, or just too scared to make the change. So let's explore that for just a moment. Kevin, why, in your experience, why is this idea of user adoption, be it process, tools, technology, so important?
Yeah, I think it comes down to outcomes. Really, is what it all comes out to. Is as a PMO, we're trying to generate the outcomes we need to support either strategic direction, benefits that we've defined inside of a project, revenue goals, revenue targets. In order to get that, we need to make sure that the tooling that's put in place can be efficiently adopted by the organization. And I think we've seen a number of times where organizations that we've worked with in the past, or even in the future, not the future, organizations that we've worked with that have had this issue where when we come in, that's part of that conversation that we're having about adoption. And typically we're looking at how do you keep it simple? How do you keep it so that you're getting only the data that you need? But to me, this is critical in getting the outcomes. If you're not getting good user adoption of your tooling, you're ultimately not going to get the outcomes you need to support your business cases, and your PMO is going to fall into that. Like we talked about earlier, your PMO falls into basically they're chasing data, which is not what you want your PMO doing. You want your PMO setting strategy and making sure that they're aligning the strategy to portfolios that are being worked on. And if that's where, to me, the user adoption piece is really critical from an outcomes perspective.
What about you mentioned technology capabilities? I mean, let's talk about that for just a moment. What are some of the I mean, for lack of a better word, feature function that a PPM solution, in your view, needs to have to be able to drive that adoption?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a really important one that all of us in the product space have to answer. And the key for me is, from a visibility standpoint, it's about providing the data, and only the data that the persona needs to support decisions they need to make, to support actions they need to take within the product. And ultimately, the tool should be facilitating a conversation. The tool should be only used to basically capture and provide that visual to that individual for the needs that they have, and allow them to get out and start doing the real job they have, which is delivering projects and working with the folks on those projects. In many cases, what we see is that we're overcome with visualization, or we're given a million different data points on a screen, when in fact we need three. And we need these three really clear ones that point us in the direction of the things that are important to our organization. And we need to be notified of that information so that we can act on it in real time. And so those are some of the things from a product perspective that I know we focused over the last few years very heavily on making sure that the visual cues that come into each of the personas are appropriate for those personas, allowing for us to customize that experience basically.
Yeah, I know we've got some. Excuse me. I know we've got some screenshots of this sort of transformation that you're talking about. Let me go to those, and can you talk us through what we're seeing here?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the top of the screen here, and this is actually pointing very directly to the conversation we were just having. On the top screen is our old interface for Keyed projects. So when you logged into the system, you got into Keyed projects and you were brought into a project view. That project view really didn't provide the value for the individual that was logging in based on the persona that they play in the organization. It basically gave you a very generic view of what the project was doing, or what was trying to define. And it was really up to you as the user to go find that information. And as you move and progress down to the middle image, we've completely changed the interface so that now when I log in as an individual user, I'm seeing exactly the things that I need to see, that I need to act on. From a visual perspective, you'll see that there's a box there. I've got 3 risks. I now need to take an action. I can click on those 3 risks, and the box below shows me, here's the 3 risks. I can take an action right here. I can review what those risks are. I can go address those items, and I can get these off my list and then get on to the job at hand. And I can see that across various different components that I need to focus on. Am I over budget? Is my project overdue in any way? Am I missing some critical milestones? I can see that quickly and I can act on it. And I can also get notified by the system of some of those things that are happening. So providing those better visualizations on the screen allows my users, I'm going to get better adoption because I'm actually providing them with useful information that they can get to quickly, they can act on quickly, and they're not spending all their time looking for information or looking for where the issue may reside. Product should be telling us where the issues reside. So that's what we've done here in this new interface.
So is this, just out of curiosity, this middle screen that we're looking at, is this actually your dashboard? I mean, are you that many days behind?
Only in preparing my expense reports, but beyond that, no.
Well, we all struggle with that. All right. So let's shift gears then. We've talked about the technology foundation, the tooling that's required to really drive adoption, which is the key to empowerment. Because when you have the team on board, you can affect change in a very reasonable way, in a very relatively fast timeline. But Outside of the tooling, how do you get the people on board with
Yeah.
a solution or a best practice approach? What's the change management involved there in your view?
Yeah, I think this is really important, and I think it's a topic that we have lots of conversations with, customers, prospects, and folks that are in the industry. And it's about, even before you bring a tool in, it's about getting the organization ready. It's about things that we've done with customers that we work with, getting your champions together, getting your early adopters available for this process. It's defining, upfront, what are we trying to achieve. It's also, these are big changes for organizations, and I think if anybody believes that implementing a tool solves all their problems, they're probably in for more. And so I think it's about taking it seriously. It's about getting early adopters. It's also about getting early disruptors, is what I would call them, and getting folks that really don't really, hey, I got my spreadsheet, I'm good, I don't need anything else. It's getting engaged with those folks, and getting them as part of the process. And typically what you want is users that are going to use the tool. Get them engaged so that they understand, they have an input into the tooling that, we potentially will pick, and the tooling and how it gets implemented for the use of within our organization. I think those are really some really critical pieces before you even get to the tooling part, is really make sure your organization is ready, and make sure that, you're looking at your processes. A lot of times we get brought in, our processes are terrible, but we think this tool is going to solve it. Well, bad process across the board is going to be bad process across the board, even if you have a tool. So it's really important to start looking at that. A lot of the things that we do from a services perspective on the way in is have a lot of those conversations. Let's look at the processes you're invoking today. Are they working for you? Are you getting the outputs that you need? And then how do we convey those into a tool? So the change management side is really important and shouldn't be overlooked.
Okay, let's actually take a look at a few examples from one of our customers at Keyed In. This is a company called Pearson Education, a very large learning management firm and testing center firm that's part of the $6 billion Pearson conglomerate. When we spoke last week with our champion there at Pearson, she showed us some of the cadence that they used at their organization to drive that change. When they implemented a PPM solution, they knew that there was going to be this period, she called it, of mourning, mourning the loss of the way things used to be, and they had this very aggressive cadence of keeping people engaged. You can see on the left everything from user workshops to even simply office hours, where people that were learning to use the system could come and get help. And on the right, you see their content library around all these different capabilities that a user could actions that a user could take within the solution. And further, she talked about some of the user group best practice sessions that they would hold. They would keep them simple. They would keep them on tips and tricks that can shave, minutes or seconds off of typical project management processes, and the result has been widespread adoption of the tool. Kevin, what would you add about Pearson's experience and some of these best practice workshops that they conducted?
Yeah, well, they were really good at the change management side, and I think some of it was they had adopted tools, other tools, and didn't approach it in that way. And one of the key things, and like I talked about earlier, is they did invoke early adopters that have been using the tools. They did a lot of trainings up front. They ingrained them into the process of selecting a tool, and they did take a very they did look at a lot of tools. I want to say when we spoke to Tracy, it was somewhere around 15 tools they looked at, including tools that they had internal in the organization that were being used by different divisions. They're a 30,000 user organization, so there are a few tools in place there. But that was, she really took that change management approach up front because she had seen it impact the adoption of other tools that they had tried to put in place. So that was a real critical point for them. And as they've gone through, they phased their approach, right? They went and they took phased approach. We're gonna celebrate small wins. One of the things they did a lot, they celebrated the small wins to ensure that they kept continually showing progress, because this is they moved from a homegrown built PMO tool that did exactly the things they needed, however, it wasn't very technologically advanced and couldn't really expand. So they were changing into more of a tool that was more streamlined from a PMO perspective. It is a change. It's a change in some of their process. So they had to invoke some of those small wins when things are hey, we were able to get this report out. Hey, look at what we can show our management now. They celebrate all those, and it's an important component to celebrate. So I think they've done a really good job of looking at it from a change perspective, but also looking at it how it impacts the adoption users, and also engaging them at the end of the day.
All right, let's move from there to sort of tie this all together. So we've talked about these concepts around having an adaptable workflow, being able to manage multiple project types and methodologies, and we've talked about some of the tooling that we recommend and that many of our clients have had great success with. We've also talked about some of the best practices around driving adoption of a PPM solution, all of which lead to this goal of being an empowered PMO. And that is one that has a very clear understanding of the value it delivers to the business and is able to adapt to changing market requirements very quickly. So Kevin, once we hit this stage of nirvana, what's the value? What's the value to the PMO and to the business of this idea of empowerment?
Well, it's huge. It's ultimately it's credibility for the PMO. They're doing their job and they're providing results. And I give you an example of a customer we have. They're managing a portfolio of projects, about $58 million worth of portfolio of projects. They struggled to budget prior to implementing a tool. Once they implemented the tool, the first year results was they were always over budget. They never were anywhere near budget, usually millions of dollars off, which is not good. And they basically gave me a call and said, hey, first year in, and our budget versus actual is less than $100,000 on a $58 million portfolio. And those were noted in the tool. So we actually had tracking of that information. And from a PMO perspective, it's shown quite well to the organizational leadership that we had control over the budgets, which is really important for a PMO. So that was some of the impact of actually having a tool in place and actually being able to support what that organization needed to be able to report. But I think for a PMO, it's credibility, it's effectiveness. I think they're necessary tools within an organization, especially organizations that are running big portfolios of programs and projects. You need to have those entities in place, and you need to be able to support the strategic objectives of the company and be able to show how those things relate to one another. So that's just one example of one of our customers that have had some success there.
So as we wrap up this part of the discussion, let me just make a couple of comments as to why we feel that Keyed In is a great partner in moving towards this state of empowerment for the PMO. We had this conversation over and over again at last week's Gartner event. And once I wrap up these comments, by the way, we will do a quick poll question, and then we'll get to your questions, which were submitted, keeping us on schedule here. But there's a few things that we feel that Keyed In does exceptionally well. We feel it provides the top-down analytics that a PMO needs to effectively plan capacity, to do portfolio analysis, to manage and forecast resources, to provide budgeting, and so forth, but does it in a solution that is very easy to use and easy to adopt. So users actually engage it. And as Kevin mentioned earlier, that leads to accurate data that allows the PMO not only to make effective decisions, but also to plan and execute that plan in a timely and a cost-effective fashion. Kevin, what would you add?
Yeah, well, I think that's I think you've hit a lot of great points in the solution, and I think it's key is we're trying to provide a simplicity around what we're doing, even though there's a lot of underlying complexities around the product. We're also trying to provide it in a fashion that allows for each persona, so each member of the party that's using the tool, to have only the information they need and to be able to use the tool just for their activities and not get overblown with a million different pieces of the tool. Whereas then from a PMO perspective, they're probably using a lot more of the tool and have more open functionality within what they're seeing. So it's about providing that simplistic view. It's about providing those outcomes. It's about providing reporting across the various portfolios, maybe based on some sort of strategic measure, and being able to provide that very quickly to senior management or outward, as well as being able to have a heartbeat of what's happening in your project. So heartbeat every month of how are our projects progressing through the process. And I think Keyed does a very good job of providing that value from both the top end and then giving those tools to a PM teams to basically be able to execute within the tool as well, while supporting the PMO objectives that we're trying to meet as an organization.
Excellent, thank you. All right, let me go ahead and stop sharing those slides, and you can see that the poll is ready there. We'd like to take a pulse on whether any of our attendees in today's webinar would like a little bit of follow-up. So please submit your answers there. And while we're doing that, Kevin, let's talk about some of these questions that have come in. One person asked, how does the tool track milestones to be able to display it on the dashboard?
Yeah, great question. So milestones are a real critical piece of Keyed. We actually track those as entities in the tool. We can link those items to various tasks within the solution, and we can display those as you saw in my earlier slides. You saw some data boxes that had some visuals in there and visual cues on overdue dates and things like that. So we can leverage those milestones and the due dates around those milestones and show those directly onto the screen. And we also have a Gantt view for any of those milestones as well, that depending on what you want to see within the system to support that milestone tracking. And then the other thing on milestone tracking is the ability to audit what's happening. As a PMO, I think it's really important that those 5 key milestones that we need to track to, that there's some sort of audit trail around those. So we do provide the ability to audit trail those and make it so that if they do change, if there is an impactful change on that those items get tracked in the system for a reason why they got changed, so that you as a PMO can actually walk through and understand what's happened across the project. But milestones are really critical within Keyed.
Well, what about issues? Does the same apply for issues in terms of tracking those, including them on a dashboard like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we showed risks on my screen. But ultimately, obviously risks are what we start with, and we at some point a risk may turn into an issue. And so in Keyed, we actually have that facility where you can actually migrate a risk to be an issue, and you can display it on the dashboard. And again, you can use any of the metadata that you're defining within your risk parameters to drive some of the notifications and the information that you've got listed on your dashboard. So all that visuals can all be configured. That screen I showed is configurable by user. So the user could go in and say, I want to see risks and issues. Another user could say, I only want to see risks. I don't care about issues, although you should. But those are some of the things that are very simple from a configuration to add into the dashboard.
We also had a question around integration. Specifically, an attendee asked, do we integrate, does Keaton integrate with ServiceNow? Maybe you can address that, but also talk more broadly about the types of integration Keaton supports.
Yeah, great. So I think ServiceNow is one that we're seeing or hearing a lot more from an ITSM perspective. We see that as an entry point really into the PMO. So being more of an intake. And we do a lot of those types of intake type of approaches into automate the creation of a project within the PMO based on some criteria from another system. Our general integration approach is we implement an integration platform. The integration platform can adhere to two sides of an application programming interface or an API, and provide the orchestration in between. Some of there are other areas that we integrate, so Salesforce opportunities into Keaton as projects. We do a lot of back-end finance systems, so you're not typically in a large PMO going to change out their ERP. So you're typically going to integrate to. So we do a lot around integration to an ERP type solution, such as like an Intact or an SAP or an Oracle type of approach, depending upon client needs.
All right, and that's all the questions. So thank you so much, Kevin. Appreciate your participation, and thanks to all of you on the line for joining us for this webinar. As I mentioned earlier, the recording and the slide deck will be available afterward, and you can receive those later on. So with that, thank you very much, and have a good day.